And so the tech companies just they want money, and they want to have people addicted to their product from day one for a lifetime. And I think that really feeds into the problem.
John, thank you for coming, sir. I appreciate you.
Hey, Matt, really happy to be on the show. Thanks for the opportunity.
Absolutely. So you and I met at a presentation where you were actually doing a book debut. It is, I believe, your fifth book. It's called It's Not About the Devil. And it, you have a surprisingly optimistic kind of point of view, considering that you're talking about really dark and intense, kind of cracks that are developing within our culture.
Yeah, and what I'm trying to do is, give people some inspiration. There's a lot of evil in our modern world, a lot of ways that people can fight that. And I wanted to showcase sort of three people on how they can, fight the good fight. And one of them was featuring Officer Gomez and his life and kind of how he really stumbled into being an expert on online predators, which is where he is now. And it's an interesting story on how he gets there, and very good lessons for parents to know about.
Yeah, absolutely. What's drawing you to this? Because a lot of the media that is around problems focuses just on that. They focus on problems. And we could have a lot to say about that, which is why aren't we presented with solutions? Why aren't we presented with a path forward? Why aren't the companies that are making this technology available to young people, for instance, in the Officer Gomez arena, the tech predation, why aren't people taking meaningful steps? In fact, I was speaking with him just this morning. He said, look, I think his wife's credit card got hacked or something. He's like, the security around a credit card is so robust, you wouldn't believe it. Like the encryption, the whole thing. And if something happens, they take it really seriously. Like, so we know that people are capable of taking meaningful, deliberate steps to keep people safe from, predators, in this case, financial predators. But why isn't that happening? Why isn't that happening in the tech world? And that's a really big question that I think people have. And Gomez has taken great steps to try to educate people, but it's still a gigantic problem.
Yeah, I think the tech companies, if you look at the history of some of these, they designed them to essentially get more eyeballs, more clicks, etc. And I've seen some research on ex Facebook vice presidents, and they designed it to be addicting. And especially that preteen and teenager brain, they're just prone to that kind of addiction. I mean, kids are attached to their cell phones these days, plenty of adults as well. But I think it really affects the teens. And today's generation is like no other. They've grown up with this stuff since day one. They have no prior experience perspective. And so the tech companies just they want money, and they want to have people addicted to their product from day one for a lifetime. And I think that really feeds into the problem.
Absolutely. There's a pediatric neurologist who I interviewed some months back, Dr. John Condi, and he had an incredible point, which is, look, let's just strip away all ridiculous sentiment here, which is, like Facebook is out to do good. Facebook is not out to do good, right? Instagram, not out to do good. TikTok, Twitter, not out to do good. And people herald these technologies as these incredible ways to connect with people. And yeah, initially, I think that was true. Like if you're the initial Pinterest person, you're like, hey, why don't we like share our crafty little things that we're doing at home or things that we find of interest? But they are absolutely 100% in it for money. And the way they make money, not 95%, not 98%, they are 100% in it to make as much money as they can. And the way they do that is to get more eyeballs on the site. So they are 100% in for making their products as attractive as possible to as many people as possible, as long as possible. That's it. That's the whole nature of their existence. MTU Studios is the proud producer for the Ada County Sheriff Podcast, the Idaho Wildlife Federation Podcast, the State Representative Ted Hill Podcast, the Idaho State PTA Podcast, and many more. If you or your organization is thinking about starting a podcast, MTU Studios would love to help. Just check out mtustudios.com.
Yeah, I mean that's absolutely what they're after. The average teenager now is spending, 8, 9 hours a day on the internet in some capacity. And it's kind of this, it's coming out backwards because these were all advertised initially as a way to connect with people. And yet it seems like people are less connected than ever, lonelier than ever, and it's because online relationships are just not the same as a real face-to-face relationship is. But that's what they're trying to sell. And then you've got people who, well, I only want to show good things on my Snapchat story, all the great times I'm having, etc. And so it gives this perception that you've got this perfect life. Some other person is looking at that, teenager perhaps, and thinking, wow, my life is so diminished compared to that. And that's going to lead to some depression, cyberbullying, etc., because people are just putting out all this fake stuff on their stories or Instagram posts and things like that.
Yeah. One thing you said that people are we're essentially having these vacant, hyper shallow relationships. In the presentation that when I met you, when it was you're presenting your book and you did a presentation at the beginning regarding all kinds of crises, right? And you were giving a lot of stats and problems, the average hours people spend on their cell phones, especially teenagers. But you also showed a video, a YouTube clip that was a a guy that figured out, okay, look, let's see if we can get teens to act in a way that is horrific. Okay. And not like, hey, send me nude photos. That happens all day, every day. But let's see if we can get a group of teen girls with the permission of their parents. Let's see if we can get a group of teen girls to actually leave their house, leave their parents, get into like an unmarked, no window van with somebody they don't know. Let's see if we can do this without ever meeting them or offering them anything other than companionship. And as horrific as it was to watch, the girls, at least one of the girls did do it, right? She waited for her parents to quote unquote leave. They were actually waiting in the van. The girl gets in the van with somebody she doesn't know, and it's a creeper van. There are no windows. This is not like a nice car that you can see
Right.
into. It's like a maintenance guy van. And she gets in, and her parents grab her from behind. She thinks she's being abducted. It was one of those things you watch. You're like, God, man. But after seeing that, I've been wondering for months, with like, okay, what drives a person to do that? What could you do to a totally normal 16-year-old girl to make her feel like that's the best option for her relationships, for her actions, whatever it is? I mean, this is a hyper risky situation, right? That's a horrible, horrible decision. But what is that? And when you talk about having these shallow relationships, do you think it's that people are starved for any kind of real in-person interaction, and they have such a lack of actual quality in-person interactions that they will accept these subpar or horrendously dangerous in-person interactions because they just need personal connection?
I think that's part of it. The other part is today's teenager looks at online relationships as the equivalent of real friendships that you might have with someone that you actually know, spend time with, maybe go to school with, etc. So they look at these as the same. So when somebody says that they have feelings for you, or hey, let's meet in person, they're expecting that to be like a real relationship. And of course, most of the times it's really not. And I think, especially when the pandemic hit, it sent people online, it got people isolated more than ever. And so I think that really helped drive this view um, that they just needed this kind of meaningful connection, and um, they're just trying so hard to find that. I was part of a nonprofit that does a survey, and it was something like 40% of ninth graders in this survey knew someone that met someone in person that they had only met previously online, which is exactly the situation of this girl going into this van. Really, no idea. And it happens so fast. That's what's really horrifying, I think, for parents, is that it can happen so quickly that the parents don't even realize, potentially until it's too late.
Right. And in the video that you shot, or excuse me, that you presented, the parents are communicating before the girl gets in the van, and they're on record. They're like, there's no way she's going to do this.
Right.
There's no way. And here the girl starts leaving the house, and I think the dad at one point's like, that's not her, she's not coming out. And then of course she goes ahead and gets in the van, and they're like, how could you do this? What do you think drives that disconnect between parents, what parents think their children will do, and what their children actually are capable of doing?
Well, I think a parent's perspective is I've told my kids there's danger, don't do this, do that type of situation. And the kids think, well, that's not going to happen to me. That's going to happen to someone else. And I
Right.
think they're just inherently a little bit trusting and believing what someone's going to tell them. They're not questioning. Maybe they haven't been jaded like some adults and are more skeptical of what's happening, but there's this sense of trust and this desire to be validated in whatever it might be. And so many teen egos are just fragile. We've all grown up during that time. It's never been easy to go to high school. And we always have this level of self doubt, no matter who we are, no matter how good of a relationship we have with our parents. But somebody else, this total stranger, is saying how great you are. Wow, that must mean something than somebody who's, just mom and dad.
Right. There's this concept that Gomez and I have actually been teasing out, which is that you willingly become the least important person in your child's life when you give them a cell phone. Right now, that's a weird thing to say, and there is a certain degree of, just a normal adolescent and child rearing, there's a certain degree of like, oh, mom or dad, you just don't understand. You don't understand what's going on. Like, these people's opinions really matter. And even though you're saying I'm great, whatever. But parents still held on a little bit, right? Like, the kids still listened a little bit in the standard, parenting paradigm. The issue now is that you have an unlimited number, and I say unlimited because even though we want to limit it, let's say there are like 7 billion people in the world, right? So it's like, okay, well, just 7 billion opinions of you. That's not actually true, because we have an unlimited number of bots. We have people with multiple accounts. I mean, it could be like 20 million social media users worldwide when there are only, 7 billion people. It's like, instead of 20 billion. So you have an almost unlimited degree of social feedback that is atypical from a person to person interaction, in that people say things, they do things, their ability to do these things without consequence leads to these horrific behaviors. And all of a sudden, people don't know how to respond. It's like they don't know how to turn it off. They don't even I, like, somebody will say something really crazy to me on somebody said it this morning. There's a city councilman out of Middleton came onto my podcast recently and talked to me about this. What is it? It's essentially a policy. I can't remember exactly what it is, but a policy they put in place that limited growth in Middleton based on the capacity of schools. Okay, and which is a real problem. We are having unprecedented growth in the Treasure Valley of Idaho, and the cities and towns around here are like, okay, well, look, I understand we have property rights, and if a farmer wants to sell the farmer's property to a developer, that's the farmer's right to do it. But if you make 3 or 4 or 500 units over here, our school, that the elementary school where the development would feed into, it's already at or way beyond capacity. So it's damaging to the existing residents. So they put this ordinance in, I believe it is, down to say, okay, you're limited there. And of course, somebody online's like, well, obviously you don't believe in freedom because you don't believe in property rights. And it's like, oh God, like, where do you even go? And I laugh at it. You got to laugh at these things because they're so out there. But even I get taken aback, and I have to think through it initially, which is, okay, do I give the very real, easy example of, okay, how about this? I'm going to find out where you live, and I'm going to build a 20-story, high-rise building and make it all affordable housing. And that can be right next door to you. Now, if you don't like that, you don't believe in property rights and you don't believe in freedom. And even I was like, nah, I'll just laugh at this guy and just let it go. But I get caught up in interacting with insanity. And I'm a 42-year-old dude who does this all day. Like, I understand how to do this. Even it catches me off guard. So the idea that, our 14 or 15 or even 12-year-olds could handle this, it's an absurd proposition.
Yeah, you're absolutely right because the kids are not going to think things through generally. I mean, adults don't think things through to and try to look at all of the different things that could affect what they're doing. So, when somebody just jumps to, well, you don't believe in property rights, they're really not taking a common sense approach. It's just kind of jumping over all the other things that need to be discussed in order to see what really makes sense. And you might have an underlying principle such as, hey, if you own this land, you should be able to do whatever you want. Okay, yeah, we could agree on that. But that doesn't mean that, you're going to put an adult theater next to an elementary school. I mean, that's kind of a
Right.
general society believes that, okay, we can be reasonable about what we can and cannot allow.
Right, but that reason is thrown out the window when you're dealing with the internet platforms, right? Be it social media or otherwise. And most do function in some way as a social media at this point. Because again, back to our point, you have to have people interacting. You want people interacting in communities, you want them interacting in forums, you want people, the old school way used to be like billboards and people would go to specific sites and see what other people were writing. I mean, you need people interacting if you're going to make it in the internet age.
Yeah, I mean, it's all about who's paying attention to what you're doing, right? And a lot of kids today look at their self-esteem based upon how many friends and followers they have, and how many people looked at my Snapchat story, and gee, I only had so many likes. What's wrong? What's wrong with me? They jump to those conclusions, and they're basing so much of what they're valuing of themselves based upon of what a bunch of strangers think that they don't even know. And I think that's going to just lead to further problems.
So let me ask you this. You've been through the pain of writing previous books. I think this was your fifth book that you published. You've gone through this process, and I can't imagine that every single time you're like, God, that was great. I mean, like writing a book is a train wreck. At least I haven't finished one. I could say I've started one, but I haven't finished one. And this is your fifth. So if I may ask, like what drove you to go after this particular topic? Like what drove you to jump on board with this thing that I think most people intuitively know, like, okay, the internet's bad, but they don't do deep dives. And I certainly know for the people I'm around, most people have no idea about the things that I've been doing with Gomez. And they're just like, they're blown away every time I talk to them. So what was it for you that steered you in this direction?
Yeah, when I look back at my kids in their childhood, and some of the most joyous moments were, in that early elementary age when they just had this, innocence and joy of childhood. And to me, anybody who wants to take that away from someone at any age is really perpetrating evil. And the way that it kind of worked for me was a little bit of a progression. I was doing some talks about human trafficking, and I started getting a lot of questions about online safety. And I was actually at a talk, and somebody said, "Hey, do you know who Officer Gomez is? Who's a school resource officer?" And I hadn't heard of him, and went and looked him up, contacted him. We had some great conversations, and I told him, look, I'd like to just take some of the bullet points from this presentation, put it into a little booklet, and use some of your expertise. Are you good with that? And he was very happy to get the word out to help parents understand what's going out there. So when I wanted to come up with my latest book, he's the first person I called because I wanted to get the deep dive of that story. And not just to show what Officer Gomez is like, but the other side of the coin. Who are these bad guys? What are they thinking? What are they saying? That real inside the mind of the predator was a fascinating yet dark and scary place. And so you see these other characters besides, the person profiled like Gomez, and you see what they're thinking, what they're going through, what's happening in their mind, and what's motivating them. It's all very dark but very insightful of how that results. And that's, to me, that's what parents need to know is you can you can do things. You can, not give your kid a smartphone, things like that. But you also want to understand what the enemy is thinking. And that's what I tried to show in these stories. To me, it's kind of like I call it dramatized nonfiction because there isn't a recording of a guy doing this, but based upon Gomez's testimony, case files, he told me this is what these guys say, this is what they're thinking, and I just expand on that to make it a character that you really get to dislike.
You really get to dislike. God, man, that's saying it lightly. Um,
Yeah,
well, what without betraying the all of the details in your book, what are those things? Because I think this is one of the things that you talked about before we hit record. We were talking about the Bible app, right?
yep,
And other very innocuous, either religious based or kid based apps that do in fact lead to real danger. And there's an assumption that is pervasive in the adult world, which is, and you see it maybe not from an intellectual standpoint, but from an action standpoint, which is there are a series of apps or a type of app that I don't have to worry about when my kid is using. For instance, Spotify. Officer Gomez just posted one of our blog post articles that was talking about sex parties on Spotify, which is insane, right? But this is very real. A mom that I know, a friend of mine said, "Hey, have you seen Spotify lately?" And I was like, "Have I? Okay, no. I mean, I use Spotify frequently to listen, like Joe Rogan or something." She said,
right,
"Here's the thing, right?" She says, "Here's the thing. She stripped her kids of a lot of technology. But she was saying, okay, look, I will allow you to listen to Spotify. Music is good, right?" And she didn't want to go the distance that I went, which is buying old school like Sony cassette players, and now we got to like record cassette tapes again and things like that. But just seeing my
right,
kids walk around with cassette players is like Walkman, like it's kind of awesome. Anyway, so she says, look, you can use Spotify. And she finds out that her daughter's on Spotify for like 5 hours a day and she doesn't know why. So she goes and asks her daughter, like, "Hey, what are you doing on Spotify? Are you just listening to music?" And she realizes her daughter's not, yeah, her daughter may be listening to music, but she's also watching TikTok videos. She figures out that you can tether TikTok to Spotify. So if you categorize your videos on TikTok appropriately, you make them like a podcast or music video or something like that, the video will migrate over to Spotify. I didn't
right.
believe this at the time. I mean, I wasn't saying she was a liar. I was like, no, for real? So I go to Spotify. Sure enough, one of the first featured podcasts as I went into the podcast area and just like searched up podcasts for me was sex parties, right? And like the first 45 seconds of the interview, which is full video, was, "Hey, what are the questions like? How frequently do you go? Do you have to send headshots? What are the questionnaires? Like blah blah blah." All about these two people who love frequenting sex parties as like a couple. It's like, oh my God, man, I would have never known. So that's an example of a series of apps that people think are safe and they act out that they believe that they're safe in this way. They're like, "Hey, you can be on Spotify, you can be on ABC Mouse, you can be on the Bible app." But that's not true. They're not safe because there are people that are thinking about ways to find safe appearing communities and infiltrate them. Like, what are those thought processes like? And again, go out and buy the book, everyone, fine. But could you give me a little information about what it is that people need to understand about those perpetrators?
Yeah, they're really coming from a dark place. So I think from a high level, they don't really have they don't really have much in their life as far as a moral compass. I mean, there's plenty of stories of people who are church going and then have this Jekyll and Hyde personality, but they clearly are selfish, looking to themselves. But there's this deep desire on most of these guys to really they want to corrupt the innocent, so the innocent are just as bad as they are, so they can point to someone else and say, look, we're all depraved. It's not just me. And I think that's the core of what they're doing. And the way that they do that is to allure uh, people who really haven't seen that kind of content before, especially if they're younger. They want to be the one who essentially corrupts that other person and brings them down a dark path exactly where they are.
So you think it's fundamentally rooted, at least in part, in the old adage that misery loves company.
I think so. Yeah, I think that's definitely part of it. I think that they're clearly not putting any kind of biblical values in their life. They're not following that. Um, and they're just, getting, all these dopamine hits by all of these explicit images. And to many people, it's very addictive. There's places out there like Fight the New Drug that talk about how pornography is like an addictive drug. Well, just like drugs, you need to go more and more down a path where not just having images, but then even more images, hence a sex party, things like that. And it just goes on and on till eventually that person might want to meet somebody in person. Screen time just isn't enough. So now they want to take the next step. And I think because it has this addiction element to it, that's why we're seeing so many of these online predators wanting more content, more depraved content, wanting to meet in person, and that I think that's part of what's driving them.
So the idea that they want to corrupt the innocent so that they potentially feel less terrible about themselves, or they can just point at other people. I got touched by malevolence, not in this way, but somebody that had moved into my neighborhood and really realized after a period of months, like, oh, you're the devil. Like you initially put on this good face and fine, whatever, but you really, I saw a couple actions where he overtly exclaimed, he's like, well, I just wanted to bring this person down because you guys think you're so much better than me and you're not. It's like, okay, this is it. Like, that's insane. But do you think that there's just essentially the root of it is pain in that person's life that they then can't deal with and they feel ashamed of, and then they just need to spread it to other people? So they're like, I'm shameful, but this guy's shameful too. Is that essentially, am I getting that essentially right?
Yeah, I think that's part of it because it's showing that, well, I have bad behavior. If I get other people to have bad behavior, then see, it's not just me, it's all these other people as well. But you bring up an interesting point, which is if you really take the high level view of I, you know, the devil is real in our society. The devil is busy in our culture. What does the devil want to do? It wants you to reject God, tempt you to sin, bring you to hell. That's the game plan of the devil. You're going to do that by breaking up families, breaking up real relationships, and by having you do these bad behavior
Right.
as often as possible. That's pretty much what you just described, where the guy said, I want to bring you down this dark path. That's the devil's plan. And you see it manifest in so many different ways.
That's really, really clear. And the temptation, I mean, the number of temptations and problems in the world are just exponentially growing. The ease with which we can get through our days, the ability to neglect real, meaningful relationships that draw out the best in us, or our obligation to our communities, even if we're not engaged in child rearing. Like, people just don't have the same sense of community and obligation to that community that they once did, and it just leaves people astray. I actually though I found a very optimistic position years back, and it got actually somebody reiterated it recently, which is the because we have an exponentially growing list of ways people can get derailed. That's bad. Let's say like 100% everybody would be better if we didn't have all of those ways, or we had fewer of the ways people could get derailed. But it's also opportunity for people to separate themselves, and it's an opportunity for people to get a step up on the competition, if you will, on the rest of society. For instance, young people, right? Like, I'm raising 3 boys. I'm not happy that we have these problems that we're going to have to address, right? And they don't have tech. They don't get to use tech. We don't let them mess around with, we took away their iPads about middle of last year because we just realized like, oh, this is insane. And pre-COVID, we were not iPad tech family, but they just got integrated into our family because they had to for school. And then everybody was on the iPads. And anyway, so we took them away, but we know we're going to have to manage these, potentially addictive and dangerous things with our boys. But to the degree that we can help them manage it, that will give them a leg up on everyone, all of their peers. When, for instance, they're going into the relationship world, they're going to the professional world. If we can keep my boys from becoming addicted to online porn, which will be no small feat, if we can, they will likely have a better view of women and relationships as they move forward. That's great, right? And if we can keep them away from being distracted at all times from, for instance, social media or video games, they will have a leg up on the rest of the people who are consumed by Fortnite and other things. That will be great. It would be better if there was no online porn and no Fortnite. But from a parental standpoint, it's like, listen, you can view this as an opportunity to improve your parenting, to get your kids a leg up. It would be better if we didn't have that opportunity, fine, but we have that opportunity. So instead of looking at it as this very dark, dreary, oh my gosh, this world is so terrible, it's like, yeah, we also have to keep them from being alcoholics. Like, that's important too. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah. What you're trying to do is really set them up for a high probability of success and happiness
Yes.
and satisfaction in their life. And you're going to have to couple that with navigating all those people that come in and out of their lives that might have those other issues. How many times have we heard about somebody who wasn't exposed to pornography, for example? They go over a friend's house who has an
Oh,
internet phone and they go, oh, hey, look at this. And all of a sudden, whoa, yeah, look at that. And I've seen plenty of accounts of that happening. So that's where your relationship with your boys are going to be so important, where they can come to you and say, hey, I wasn't expecting this, but this is what happened. And you can kind of talk through it. And having that relationship is going to be critical from, you know, having them go to that next step where they're all of a sudden then going down this path where they feel like they can't stop and they're going over that friend's house every day.
okay. Can you talk to me about this example you brought up? Because this is something that I'm so worried about. And there's a lot to be said about anxious parenting. Uh, I'm not super worried about my kids going to the best college ever. And frankly, I'm not worried about them going to college. If it's right for them, we will see that play out through their academics, most likely, but I'm not that worried about it. I'm also not worried about them getting kidnapped, right? And that's a large concern. And I think that's a national concern for a lot of reasons, but it's not a major concern for me. What I am
Sure.
concerned about is for them going over to a friend's house that has free reign of tech and doing exactly what you just said. Even a very ridiculous small example that I initially laughed about with my neighbor. I had a neighbor, he's got, I think his son was 7 or 8 at the time. And one of the neighbor kids comes over and they're playing on an iPad, and the neighbor kid says, hey, Google sexy butts. And the kid who was like, who's 7 or 8 was like, what? He's like, yeah, put in sexy butts. I don't even think they spelled it right. Right. Like, these are little kids and they
Yeah.
do. And it brings up like, bikini models and all this stuff. So it didn't bring up any like hardcore pornography. And the kid leaves. And then the son, who's the 7 or 8-year-old, is really affected by this. And he tells his mom and he starts crying and he freaks out because he knows what he saw wasn't good. Like, this wasn't something you were supposed to do. And that's just, it happens in an instant. And you don't know what kids have access to it from a technological front, right? Like, people used to say, hey, you should worry if the house you're sending your kid to has a pool. Does it have a gate around it? Okay, great. And then it became like, you should worry about guns. And it's like, okay, great. But like, we have a much higher probability of dying from a pool, So people worry about this checklist of things you have to ask the other parent. But the tech, like, do they have access to tech? It's like, everybody would say yes. And then this kind of stuff just happens in a heartbeat. Like, what has your experience been talking to parents, or children that have been exposed to this stuff?
Yeah. I think first and foremost, and it's kind of parenting 101, you need to know who your kids' friends are. And then you need to know
Yeah.
who your kids' friends' parents are. That's the first thing. But even the best of families, that scenario where somebody says, hey, take a look at this, that's going to happen, Matt. I mean, there's just no way
Right.
around it, whether it happens in college or high school or in a bigger group, or what's happened is if they have a phone, somebody will send a picture to a group chat or a group text or some kind of group situation, and the next thing you know, your kid has something on their phone. I That's what I've talked to parents about a lot, who have their kid has a phone, but they're restricted. Maybe they have parental control software, things of that nature. But the next thing you know, somebody has airdropped an explicit picture or video and they just blast it out to everybody. And that happens way more often than parents think. So you just have to prepare and brace yourself that that's going to happen at some point. The thing that you want to be able to do is pump the brakes on it as it's happening so the kid does come to the parent. They can talk through it, figure out, what they may or may not need to do as a next step, and see if that's, if it happened at a friend's house, do they want to continue that friendship? It's going to happen. I think there's no way around it, but parents have to have those conversations in advance. Otherwise, it's you're going to just lose control very quickly.
Well, okay, yes, I agree with everything you said. And additionally, just think about the time when they're not at a friend's house, but they're not at your home. Oh, I don't know, maybe the 8 hours when they're at school. Like
Right.
this is another issue that there's a big problem in my mind with school technology, and it's a different conversation for sure. But the reality is that school technology is not 100% safe, and people are starting to realize this. And so these Chromebooks and tablets and whatnot that get sent home, parents make the assumption that they're safe because, hey, there's a monitoring system on it or something like that, or this is school issued tech. It's stripped down pretty basic. But kids are very, very resourceful and find ways to get access to all kinds of things. And some kids actually get hurt, which is horrific. And again, this is something that's developing. But even if you can get the kind of, like, when my kids come home with their Chromebooks from school, we actually we take the Chromebooks and we put them in a charging area in our pantry. The kids don't get access to them. They can't go and use them unless there's something they explicitly have to do with school. Now, mind you, I know I sound crazy compared to other parents where I'm like, they don't get tech when they come home. They don't even get video games. Like, they get nothing. And yeah, we're going to have to ease into it. But the big concern I have is, okay, even if I lock down my house, what's happening at school? Like, we already know that kids use their Chromebooks at school for non-school related things during lunch, during breaks. My oldest, who's now going into 7th grade, talks about this extensively, which is he has a really hard time socializing with people because a lot of the people he's friends with during class just go straight to their Chromebooks during lunch and break. And so my son is kind of like, what do I do? And it's a terrible question because it's like, well, I would say just find another group of friends, but if everybody is doing it, like, you got to find the needle in the haystack, the one person who is also not on their Chromebook or stuck on their phone. And by the way, do you even like that person? Do you even get along with them? Do you have anything in common? So it's such the amount of time that our kids are out of our control and away from our view and able to be exposed to things, it almost seems like it's impossible to even take meaningful steps because, yeah, we don't let them go over to a lot of people's houses where they're out of our view, but they go to school every day.
Yeah, the culture of teens today is, you're right. When they have a break, they go right to their phone and beyond that until break's over, whether that's lunchtime or anything else. And it would be hard for your kid to find somebody who isn't also doing that. And
Right.
he's probably going to get made fun of because he's not on social media, doesn't know about whatever's going on, the gossip and et cetera, all the stuff that kids, talk about in the school drama. And so it's, you know, there's not a lot of there's no silver bullet answer, unfortunately, other than to, consider homeschool groups, people like that are like-minded as you, because unfortunately you're going to be the exception on how you handle that. Most of the times the parents don't care. I was talking to a police officer whose child got a picture of other students engaged in illicit activity, airdropped it to 20 plus people in school during school hours, and the parent was brought into the police officer's office, and the answer was, well, what can I do? It's too bad. The parent basically didn't care. So you're dealing with a lot of parents who are not coming from your perspective. They're not really that engaged. They don't really see it as a problem. That's the biggest problem to me, is Why don't the parents, why don't the kids see this kind of behavior as a problem?
Well, yeah, and that's a felony. Like
Yeah,
the
well, maybe.
profound disconnect is, well, yes, that's right, maybe, right? And again, after the, I believe in, at least in the state of Idaho, the first infraction is a misdemeanor, and then beyond that it becomes a felony. If you're underage, even sharing pictures of yourself, it
Yeah.
can be a felony, right? So and beyond that, it's, like the moral degradation of our youth, down to the point where we're making all of our young women, it's not me and you, but the culture of cell phones and social media and the pervasive nature of this is that we're turning our young women, our 14, 15, 16-year-old women, into amateur porn stars that are going along with either willingly sending pictures of themselves, sending pictures unsolicited, yeah, agreeing once they're proposed, or even engaging in worse acts as they're being filmed. It's like, that's not going to create stable family units in 10 and 15 years. Like, this could be a large hit towards the stability and capacity for the next generation of Americans actually to pair up successfully in a long-term manner and raise children.
Yeah, I mean, how does a person who comes from that mindset turn into having a successful long-term marriage and having a great relationship when, as Gomez talks about how certain body parts have certain dollar values. If that's kind of your grooming uh, as a young person, how do you bring that into a marriage situation and have it be successful? And I think the answer is you don't. It's going to turn into more of very short relationships, more um, more physical and transactional rather than intimate and loving. That's why we're seeing marriage being devalued. That's why we're seeing things like the attitude towards abortion as no big deal, as shouting it, being proud about it. And we're seeing that cultural shift because as you said, they're turning into these kind of amateur porn stars. And when you've seen these images and all your friends are doing it and asking for pictures, doesn't seem all that unusual. And that's kind of where we are now. I was talking to a different police officer who said that, this senior boy on the first day of school went and asked for a nude picture of every freshman girl, and some were peer pressured into doing that. And it's only when they went to the school resource officer and said, "Hey, this boy is doing that," did did the behavior stop. And so some are going to fall into this level of peer pressure, and part of it is because it just doesn't seem that odd because it is pervasive. It's a vicious cycle, and I think it's going to turn into people not really knowing what a healthy relationship looks like.
God, man, that's first off, I 100% agree. The nature of a healthy relationship, not just, I mean, I think we talk about healthy expectations from young men, right? They see a lot of pornography, they think that's real intimacy, and it's, very,
Right.
it's terrible, right? It's not good. But the relationship from a female standpoint of, men just want this, or my every experience I've ever had, this is all guys want. It's like, well, that's going to be damaging as well, because obviously that's not what all that men want. And having a jaded perspective of men, of a gender, just blanket, this is all men, that's really bad. And we already saw enough of that without the internet, right? Like, you had
Yeah.
enough, young women that make it to adulthood that are like, oh my gosh, my teenage boyfriend was like a moron, or like, oh my God, he was such a dog. Yeah. And like, I'm sure he was. Like, I totally understand that that's a possibility. But the, again, the issue with people not caring about it, the pervasive nature of it, that you could have somebody who was effectively shielded in a herd protected mentality, because it's like, well, look, you should not get mad at me, a 17 or 18-year-old, for propositioning 300 freshman girls or 200 freshman girls that are 14 years old to get illegal pornographic images from them, being successful with some of them. Like, if that were a thing 20 years ago, some guy went around to every single girl and was like, let me get a shot of you topless. Like he would not make it 10 minutes. He would get turned in. But because it's so common, because we all, it's like speeding. I liken it to speeding all the time, which is, look, nobody gets a ticket for going the 60 or 59 in a 55 because everybody's already
Right.
breaking the law. You have to be like egregiously breaking the law. You got to be like 20, 30 miles over the speed limit. But we all tolerate, this is something I've explained to my boys. They'll be like, hey, dad, the speed limit's 55. You're going 57 or 58 or 60. Why is that? It's like, well, this is, well, I mean, like, this is just kind of what people do. And it's the same thing now. It's like, you're a 14-year-old girl, 5 guys in a day ask you for nude photos. You ask your friend, they're like, oh yeah, this is just what boys do. And it's like, well, do I do it? And I don't know what the answer would be. I don't know what the conversation is, but I do know some people do. And the older you get, the more frequent it is. I think Officer Gomez has a stat that's something around like 90% of 17-year-old women admit to having sent nude photos of themselves.
Yeah, and I mean that's where you've got to have these conversations early about with your girls about, having some self-respect. Where does your self-esteem come from? And what do real relationships look like? Because if this is what they think, that it's just all, physical, transactional, and, boys are just going to be, animals essentially. Well, there's the flip side of that too, of that's how you have to have that conversation with your boys on, how do you treat women? How do you respect that? How do you have, real intimacy? And, part of that is going to be centered around your values, hopefully biblical values that really, can help strengthen that talk. Because one of the most important things a parent can do is to guide their child to pick a good spouse. I mean, that to me is probably top three of what a parent's job is doing. Because if you don't, you're in a world of hurt for a long time if you pick a lot of bad relationships, for sure.
Oh gosh. And even pre iPhone, pre social media, we already had problems with this.
Yes.
Like it's not, I mean,
It's
it's
not new.
hard enough. Oh my gosh, I know it's not new. This just compounds it, right? Because
Yeah.
even, oh, I just, it's some darkness, but optimistic nonetheless, because again, your book really focuses on people taking meaningful steps to fight this onslaught, and some may view it as fighting the tide. And I've had that conversations with people in the work I've done with Officer Gomez and with different educators throughout my state. I have those conversations, and people are very common administrators or teachers or people just kind of almost blow it off because they're like, look, yeah, what are we going to do? It's like, we're going to do something. We're not doing nothing, right? We're going to take this as seriously as it is. If you knew 20 years ago that a bulk of your students were amateur porn stars or passing around in a felony manner underage pornography, you would have taken grand steps at that moment, right? It's only because everybody's doing it now that you think you get a pass. You don't. You still need to take it seriously. So what are things that you feel like we should be optimistic about, having spoken with all the law enforcement agents and followed these people?
Yeah, I mean, one of those other top three things of a parent should do is to protect their kids, right? And so
Right.
you can't solve a problem unless you are first aware of it. So
Right.
part of this, the podcast that you're doing, working with the legislature, me writing these books, part of it is getting awareness out there so parents understand the dangers are real. They can be frequent. It's not a one-off exception, and that's the first part that you have to understand is what's kind of out there. That's where it's then becoming to navigate your kid through relationships, whether that's, um, with a girlfriend, with friends, with other adults. And I'm going to guess that by being aware, they're going to pick out people very quickly and be perceptive. Does this person have their act together? Do they really respect themselves? Do they respect others? They're going to figure that out pretty quickly because, as you said earlier, that's one way that your kid can essentially stand out from the crowd. And
Right.
that's going to be, people want to hang around people with good character. They're going to
Yes.
attract other great people. And so, yeah, they might have to, kiss a bunch of frogs, so to speak,
Ah,
to get to the princess. But I mean, that's part of growing up, right? I mean, the dating scene
right.
was always difficult. Growing up was always difficult. Having good friends that are going to, you know, essentially make you a better person versus take you down.
Right.
Those are conversations that should happen before the internet. Does this person bring you up? Is it making you a better version of yourself? Yes or no? Make it black and white. And, by having some of this knowledge, their perception, they're going to figure it out pretty darn fast, would be my guess.
That's great. Well, John, listen, I've had you on. I know we were shooting for about 45 minutes here.
Yeah.
Thank you for what you're doing. We've talked about a lot of different things. And again, the book is called It's Not About the Devil. Go grab a copy. I love Gomez. He's an incredible person, and his story in that book is wonderful, but there are additional other things that are equally great. Is there anything we've missed or you'd like to hit in particular at the end here?
Yeah, I just wanted to, there are two other people featured in this book. One of them is an abortion doctor who turns into a pro-life advocate, and it's her transformational journey. I think a lot of people will find how that transformation came to be very interesting and inspirational. The final chapter is an insider's view of an exorcism. And, what does Hollywood get right? What does it get wrong? And really hearing from an expert, from the guy who literally wrote the training manual on how to train men to be exorcists. I think it's a fascinating story. And it's also, the moral of the story is shouldn't be a big surprise. When you chase vices versus virtues, you're going to attract dark forces, whether that's whether that's the demonic or just a bad set of friends. It's pretty logical. And so this last chapter really shows how that happened through interesting plot lines. So I appreciate the time, and all my books are sold on Amazon and Barnes and Noble. You could definitely check that out.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, again, thank you for the work you're doing. Thank you for trying to bring attention to this. It is super complex. And again, as a parent myself, getting educated and trying to raise children, it's wonderful to have additional resources from people that have done all the footwork, have talked to all the police, have talked to different victims, and really run the gamut of, okay, what do people need to know? So again, thank you for what you're doing, and hopefully we can have you on again.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Really appreciate the time to connect with your audience.
Absolutely. Talk to you soon. MTU Studios is the proud producer for the Ada County Sheriff Podcast, the Idaho Wildlife Federation Podcast, the State Representative Ted Hill Podcast, the Idaho State PTA Podcast, and many more. If you or your organization is thinking about starting a podcast, MTU Studios would love to help. Just check out mtustudios.com.